My dad snapped. "We built this house for family, not for you." So I slid the will across the table, told him he'd already lost my support, and watched his smile fade when he realized I'd cut off every dollar. The worst part was that I almost laughed when he said it, not because it was funny, because it was so absurdly unfair that for a second my brain treated it like a bad joke. We were sitting in the half-finished dining room of the house I had been helping pay for over 2 years. There was still plastic over one of the windows. The baseboards were stacked in the hallway. The kitchen sink was connected, but nothing else in the kitchen matched. A fan was humming in the corner because the place still ran hot during the day, and the smell of new drywall mixed with sawdust and paint made my head feel light. My dad had on the same faded work boots he always wore when he wanted to look like the man in charge. My stepmother, Linda, had her arms folded so tight across her chest that her knuckles were white. My younger half-sister kept staring at the table like she wanted to disappear into it. And I was looking at the folder I had brought with me, which held every receipt, every bank statement, every transfer, and the copy of my mother's will that had somehow become the most important piece of paper in my life. I had not gone there planning to start a war. I had gone there because the contractor had called me that morning asking why the latest payment had not cleared. That was the first thing that made me suspicious. The second was the way my dad acted when I asked about it. He kept talking around the issue, blaming a bank delay, then a payroll hiccup, then some nonsense about timing. I knew my dad well enough by then to recognize when he was trying to make me feel guilty before I had the facts. So I did what I always did when something felt off. I checked everything. That habit had saved me more than once. It had also ruined a lot of lives. I grew up in central Missouri, in a town small enough that everyone knew whose truck was in which driveway and whether your lawn had been mowed this week. My mom died when I was 17. She had been the steady one in our house, the one who balanced the checkbook with a pencil and kept receipts in labeled envelopes. When she got sick, she handled her paperwork like she was expecting the worst, which I did not understand at the time. After she died, I found out she had left the 12 acres behind our old place to me in her will. Not to my dad, not to the whole family, to me. At the time, that felt like one of those sad little details adults never explain well enough to a teenager. I was too broken up to think hard about land, taxes, probate, or what it meant to own anything at all. The land stayed in my name because my dad said there was no reason to rush anything. He told me it would just sit there until I was older and ready to decide what to do with it. I believed him. That was mistake number one. About a year after my mom died, my dad married Linda. She had 2 kids of her own from a previous marriage, both already grown. Her son was the kind of guy who always had a reason why everything was someone else's fault. Her daughter acted sweet in public and acted like I was a guest in my own family whenever no one else was around. I was 21 then, trying to keep my head down, working long shifts and helping where I could. When my dad started talking about building a new house on the land, I thought it was his way of trying to create something stable after all the mess. He said the old place was falling apart. He said we could build a home that would fit everybody. He said my mom would have wanted the family to stay together. I was dumb enough to let that line get to me. He framed it like I was being asked to help my own family, not to hand over money to him, not to subsidize a dream house for a man who had never once been good with money, a family project. That was how he sold it. I was 23, making decent money at the utility company after trade school, and I thought helping was the right thing to do. I thought maybe this was the thing that would make my dad proud of me, so I started helping. First, it was the permit fees, then a deposit for the foundation, then materials because the price of lumber jumped and my dad said the lender was being slow, then appliances because Linda wanted better ones than the contractor package included, then furniture because the house was supposedly for the whole family and everyone needed a say. I never gave him cash directly. That part mattered to me. I paid invoices. I paid vendors. I paid the bank through transfers that had my name attached. I made sure there was a paper trail because my mother had taught me that if a thing mattered, it needed proof. At first, I kept telling myself it was temporary, just until the loan closed, just until the framing was done, just until the roof was on, just until the house was livable. Except every time one phase ended, another expense appeared. The septic system cost more than expected. The driveway needed gravel. The electric hookup required an upgrade. The county wanted another inspection. The contractor wanted a change order. Linda wanted different cabinets. My dad wanted to add a 3rd bathroom because he said families needed space. What he really meant was that Linda's kids were always around. Her son, Ryan, had no plan and no job worth mentioning. Her daughter, Megan, was never going to live far from her mother as long as someone else was paying. I did not fully understand that at the beginning. I told myself I was helping my dad and my stepfamily build a place they could finally settle into. I told myself I was being mature. I told myself family was supposed to help family. The first real warning sign came when I asked where my room would be. I had been paying for the construction long enough by then to feel like a fool for caring, but I asked anyway. I wanted to know where I would stay when I came over, where my stuff would go, whether I would still have a room in the house that was supposedly being built on land my mother had left to me. My dad acted like I had asked something ridiculous. He said there would be space. He said I could sleep on the couch if I stayed overnight. He said I was not there much anyway. I laughed at that one too, except it was one of those hurt laughs that makes your stomach tighten. I had spent every other weekend there hauling materials, helping paint, moving boxes, meeting the electrician, and sitting through endless family discussions about tile colors. But in his head, I was not a resident. I was a helper. That was when I first felt the shape of the thing I was in. It was small at first, a prick in the back of my mind, then another one. I started paying closer attention. I noticed how Linda talked about the house like it was her project, even though she had never put in a dime. I noticed how Ryan started telling people he was going to have the big upstairs bedroom once the house was done. I noticed how my dad kept making jokes about me being the responsible one, which was his way of saying I would keep paying no matter what. I also noticed that nobody ever asked me what I actually wanted. Not really. Not about the house. Not about the land. Not about anything. The house started as a simple build and turned into a money pit. I tried to slow down after the first major overrun, but every time I hesitated, my dad found a way to make it personal. If I complained about a bill, he said I was turning my back on the family. If I asked for copies of invoices, he said I was acting like a banker instead of a son. If I said I needed to think before approving another expense, he would tell me I was making things harder than they had to be. I hated that he could still make me feel like a kid who had not done enough, so I kept paying, not recklessly. I stayed organized. I knew the total going out every month. I knew which account each transfer came from. I knew which expenses had my name on them. I knew which ones were in my dad's name. I knew exactly how much I had sent over the first year and a half. It was enough to buy a decent house in my town if I had been acting like a normal person. Instead, it bought lumber, plumbing, siding, tile, appliances, fixtures, and a lot of resentment. Then the contractor changed. The original guy had been patient, not cheap, but patient. He had explained things in a way that made me trust him. He retired halfway through the build and turned the job over to another crew that answered to a small local company out of Colombia. That is when the paperwork started getting sloppy. Or maybe it had always been sloppy, and I just did not know enough to see it. The new office started sending invoices with numbers that did not line up with the earlier estimates. The dates were wrong. A few of the charges were duplicated. Once a payment got applied to the wrong phase of work and nobody caught it for 3 weeks. My dad brushed all of it off. He said construction was messy. He said people who focused on paperwork never got anything built. That was the other thing about him. He liked to make discipline sound like paranoia. I kept my mouth shut and kept copies. My mother had taught me to do that too. I used a spreadsheet at first, then I started backing it up to the cloud because I wanted a second record in case my laptop died. I photographed every signed receipt. I saved every email. I kept every text that mentioned money. I did not fully know why I was doing it yet. I only knew that my stomach felt wrong whenever my dad got vague about the finances. The thing that made everything click did not happen in a dramatic way. No one confessed. No one got caught in a huge lie. It was just a small call from the county recorder's office after I asked for copies of the property documents. I had gone there because I wanted to see exactly how the land was titled. My dad had started speaking about the house as if it belonged to him by birthright, and I needed to know whether I was being paranoid or stupid. The clerk was polite in that flat government office way. She pulled up the record. She gave me copies. And there it was, my name. Not my dad's, not Linda's, mine. The land had never been transferred. The probate paperwork from my mother's estate had gone through years earlier exactly the way she wrote it. I owned the parcel the house was being built on. I had been paying to build a house on land I already owned, while my dad walked around as if he were doing me a favor by letting me have a say. I sat in my truck in the county parking lot for a long time after that. Not because I was emotional exactly, because I was trying to piece together what that meant. It meant my dad had never truly owned the land. It meant the house would sit on property tied to my name. It meant every conversation we had about family space and future plans had been built around an assumption that was false from the start. It also meant my dad had been comfortable letting me spend thousands without ever bothering to tell me the truth. That should have been enough to make me angry. It did make me angry. But more than that, it made me quiet. I have learned that when a person has been lying to you for a long time, the first good move is usually not to confront them. It is to understand exactly what they can prove, what they think they can prove, and what you can prove without warning them. So I went home and pulled the probate file for my mom's estate from my own records. I had a copy because I always kept copies. Then I compared it with the deed I had gotten from the county. Then I compared both with the messages from my dad, the invoices, and the payment history. The pattern was ugly, but it was clear. I was not imagining things. I was not overreacting. My dad had used my grief, my age, and my trust to build a financial arrangement that depended on me staying too polite to ask questions. The next day I called the contractor. I asked for a balance sheet on the project. I asked which payments had been received and which had not. I asked for every pending bill tied to the job. The office manager sounded annoyed at first, then suspicious, then suddenly a lot more respectful when she realized I was the name connected to the land and the payments. That was the second time I realized my dad had been freeloading on the assumption that he controlled a thing he never legally controlled. The office manager gave me a list that made my stomach turn. There were charges for extra lumber, extra labor, a custom pantry, upgraded flooring, and fixtures Linda had picked out without asking me. There was also a payment hold because the last draw had not cleared the way the project manager expected. That was the call I had gotten that morning. A hold, not a delay. A hold, meaning somebody upstream had failed to fund something. I checked my bank. I had not approved the transfer. I checked the automatic payments I had set up. I had canceled them a week earlier after the county records convinced me I needed a pause. I had not told anyone yet. I wanted to know whether my dad would bring it up honestly or try to lie his way around it. He chose lying. That is what led to the dinner. He asked me to come out to the house after work. He said the family needed to discuss the final stages. He said there had been a misunderstanding with the payment schedule. He said he did not want a scene. He said it like he knew there would be one. I brought the folder anyway. I arrived just before dark. The unfinished place looked even sadder than it had during daylight. The porch light was on, but the yard was still just packed dirt and half-finished landscaping. A stack of drywall sheets sat by the garage. The contractor's trailer was gone. The front door stuck the way cheap doors do when the frame is still settling. Inside, the dining room had a table we had probably paid too much for because Linda wanted it to look like a real home instead of a construction site. My dad had obviously planned the seating. He had put himself at the head of the table. Linda sat to his right. Her kids were on the other side. My younger sister, Hannah, was near the end. I was alone across from him. That should have told me something too. There was food on the table, but nobody was really eating. I remember noticing that the rolls were cold, and the green beans had probably come from a can. Nobody had bothered to make it feel like a family meal. It felt more like a committee meeting where one side had not been invited to know the agenda. My dad started by saying there was an issue with the next payment. He did not ask why I had frozen the transfer. He did not ask if I had seen the new invoice. He did not ask whether I wanted to review the numbers. He just acted as if I had failed in a duty I owed him. I asked to see the invoice. He said it was already handled. I asked who had approved the extra work. He said it had been necessary. I asked who had signed for it. He said I was making things difficult. That was when I knew he still thought I would fold. He thought the old version of me was still sitting at that table. The version that wanted approval. The version that wanted peace more than fairness. The version that would rather pay than cause a problem. Instead of pushing, I took the folder out. I set it on the table. I opened it. I pulled out the copy of my mother's will first. I had not brought it because I wanted to be dramatic. I had brought it because it was the cleanest way to end the argument I knew was coming. The will was short, plain, the kind of document my mom would have trusted because it did not waste words. It named me as the sole beneficiary of the land. It named me as the one responsible for the parcel after probate. It did not give my father any ownership. It did not mention Linda at all. It was the thing he had spent years pretending did not matter. I slid it across the table toward him. He did not pick it up right away. He looked at me with that half-smile he used when he thought he was dealing with a child. Then he laughed a little and said the house was for family, not for me. That was the exact sentence that flipped something in me, not because it was new, because it was the first time he had said out loud what had been there all along. In his head, I was useful because I was reliable. I was family when he needed money. I was not family when he had to share control. That was the moment my calm finally became stronger than his confidence. I told him in the most even voice I could manage that he had already lost my support. I said I had checked the county records. I said the land had never left my name. I said I had paid every invoice I had agreed to pay, but I was not funding another dollar. I said the next draw had already been stopped. I said the bank would not get another approval from me because there was nothing left to approve. His face changed first in confusion, then irritation, then a kind of stunned embarrassment that I had never seen on him before. Linda finally picked up the will. I could see the exact second she realized the paper was real. Her eyes moved over it too fast, then again slower. Ryan looked from me to my dad and back again like he was waiting for the adults to explain why the floor had moved. Hannah was crying silently by then, though I do not think she knew exactly what she was crying about. My dad tried to recover. He said I had no right to do this at dinner. He said we were in the middle of something important. He said I was being selfish and petty and disrespectful to the people who had taken me in. That one almost got me. Almost. Because that was one of his favorite tricks. He would take a legitimate grievance and bury it under moral language until I felt guilty for having a boundary. But I had spent too long looking at records by then, so I asked him whether the contractor knew he had been authorizing change orders on property he did not own. He went still. I asked him whether the lender knew the last payment had been stopped because I had canceled the transfer after reviewing the title documents. He looked at me like he wanted to speak, but nothing came out. I asked him whether he had planned to tell me that he had been acting like the owner for 2 years while spending my mother's property and my money to build a house that he now wanted to use to push me out. He said I was twisting everything. That was the moment I felt a deep tiredness settle in my chest. Not anger anymore, just tiredness. I told him I was not twisting anything. I told him I had all the records. I told him I had already spoken with the contractor and the lender. I told him the house was not going to get another draw until this was sorted through a lawyer. That got Linda moving. She started talking fast, trying to explain how everyone had assumed things were fine, how the house had always been meant to keep the family together, how I was misunderstanding the spirit of what they had done. She made it sound noble. That was one of the more irritating things about her. She could put a ribbon on almost anything if she thought it made her look less responsible. I let her finish. Then I told them both that no one had asked me for consent on the extra spending. No one had sent me the revised budgets. No one had told me Ryan would be moving in before I had a room. No one had mentioned that my name was being used in conversations about the house without my permission. And no one had the right to tell me I was not family while they were using my inheritance to build walls around themselves. Nobody answered that one. The room just went quiet, not dramatic quiet, the kind that makes your ears ring. I watched my dad look at the will again, then at me, then at the folder. I could tell he was trying to decide whether he could still bully his way through it. That is a funny thing about people like him. They often think truth is just another version of pressure. They do not always understand when the room has changed. I had one more document in the folder, a copy of the current deed. I pulled that out and put it on top of the will. Then I pointed to the name on the page. I did not need to say much. The paper said enough. I had owned the land all along. That was when the smile disappeared. Not all at once, it sagged. He had built a house, a story, and a sense of entitlement on top of a legal fact he never bothered to verify because it was easier to believe I would never challenge him. For the first time in my life, I saw him understand that being loud was not the same as being right. My dad asked how long I had been planning this. I told him I had not been planning revenge. I had been checking paperwork. That was honest. It was not theatrical. It was just true. He asked whether I was really going to leave them with an unfinished house. I said I was leaving them with the house they had already built on my property. There was a difference. He asked what he was supposed to do now. I told him that was between him, the lender, the contractor, and his own bank account. That was the point where he got angry enough to make the first real mistake. He raised his voice. He started saying I owed him for raising me. He started saying he had fed me, housed me, and taught me how to be a man. He started saying I was disrespecting my father over money. I could feel the old reflex trying to kick in. The one that said keep the peace. The one that said do not embarrass your family. The one that said fathers should not be cornered in front of everyone. But then I remembered how many times I had skipped my own weekends, missed birthdays, and drained my savings because I was trying not to embarrass him by asking for transparency. So I opened the folder again. I had printed out the transfer history. I had printed out every payment I made directly tied to the build. I had highlighted the amounts. I had totaled them on the last page. I put those pages on top too. Then I showed him the sum. He had spent the better part of 2 years talking as if he had somehow carried this project with his own sweat. The actual number said otherwise. I had paid more than he had. A lot more. There was a long silence after that. Linda looked at the total and went pale in a way that made me think she had not understood how much of the money had been mine. Maybe she had assumed it was family money. Maybe she had assumed my dad had some secret savings. Maybe she had just never cared who was carrying the weight as long as the lights stayed on. That is the thing about people who get used to being helped. They stopped noticing the helper. The room was tense enough that even Ryan stopped pretending he was not listening. Hannah finally spoke up, though not much. She said she did not understand why the house had become such a fight. I almost felt sorry for her. She had been dragged into adult mess she did not create. I told her I did not want a fight. I wanted honesty. There was a difference there, too. Nobody had a good answer. My dad tried one last angle. He said my mom would be ashamed of the way I was acting. That one hit hard enough that I had to breathe through it, because he knew exactly where that knife went. My mom had been the kind of person who believed in keeping your word. She also believed in records, boundaries, and not letting people spend money that was not theirs. If she had lived long enough to see this mess, she would have hated the dishonesty first and the disrespect second. So I told him that if he really wanted to invoke her name, he should have remembered she was the one who put the land in my name. I said she had not trusted him to handle it. That was the truth he hated most of all. He had no comeback for that. The dinner ended badly after that. Nobody finished eating. Linda took the kids into the kitchen. Hannah went to the porch and cried. My dad stayed in his chair long enough to pretend he was not shaken. I let him sit with it. Then I stood up, collected my folder, and told him I would be in touch through the bank and my lawyer. He asked whether I was actually threatening him. I told him I was informing him. That was another thing my mom taught me. Do not argue with a fact like it is an opinion. I went home that night feeling strangely empty, not victorious, just done. I did not sleep much. I kept seeing his face when he understood I had control of the money. I kept hearing his voice when he said the house was for family, not for me. That sentence had come from a place deeper than anger. It had come from certainty. He had really believed he could say it and still get the money. That was what hurt most. The next morning, I called my bank and stopped every automatic transfer tied to the project. I called the contractor and told them to freeze further work until I had reviewed the contract with an attorney. I called a lawyer in Springfield who handled property and probate issues and made an appointment for that afternoon. I also pulled all my records into one packet and made a second copy for myself. Old habit, still useful. The lawyer looked at the documents, looked at the deed, looked at the will, and then looked at me like he had seen this sort of thing before. He did not act shocked. That actually made me feel better. People who deal with property disputes for a living rarely waste time with drama. He told me the land was mine. He told me my father had no legal claim to it unless there had been a transfer I had not signed. There had not. He told me any construction liens would attach to the property depending on how the contracts were written, but the financing and ownership facts were in my favor. He told me not to threaten anyone verbally. He told me to keep everything in writing. He told me to send notice to the contractor, the bank, and my father. He also told me to think carefully before deciding whether I wanted to let the house continue at all. That was the first time I realized I might not just be stopping payments. I might be stopping the whole thing. That made my stomach twist. I had spent so much time helping that I had started to think of the unfinished house as a family obligation instead of a business arrangement. It was hard to accept that the thing I had tried to save might have to die to keep me from being trapped in it. I spent the next few days putting the notice together. It was not emotional. It was precise. I told them the transfers were ending. I told them no new charges were authorized. I told them the property belonged to me. I told them all future communication about the build had to go through my attorney. I sent copies to the contractor, the bank, and my dad. The contractor responded first, then the bank, then my dad. He called me 12 times in one afternoon. I did not answer. He texted long messages that swung between guilt, anger, and threats. I saved everyone. He showed up at my apartment once, which I refused to open the door for. He sat in his truck outside for 20 minutes and then drove off. That was the moment I knew the panic had really started. Not because of me, because of what he had left unfinished. The contractor had already stopped the next phase of work. The framing crew did not come back. The lender put the project under review. A few days later, I got a notice about the unpaid balance and a warning about possible default if the next draw was not funded. I forwarded that to my lawyer. My dad had apparently been telling people I was overreacting and that I would calm down once I had time to think. He told his brother that I was trying to blackmail family. He told Linda's kids that I wanted to steal the house back. He told Hannah that I had lost my mind over paperwork. The weirdest part was that I was not even interested in punishment. I just wanted out. But people who have benefited from your silence often think your boundary is aggression. 3 days after the dinner, my Aunt Denise called me. She was my mom's sister. We had not always been close. Mostly because my dad made sure family visits never lasted long enough for real conversations. She told me she had heard that something was wrong with the house. She also told me, in a voice careful enough that I knew she had thought about this for a while, that my dad had been talking for months about how the house would be better if it were mostly for the people who were actually around. That line was his way of saying I was less important because I was not living under his roof. She said she had assumed he was just being his usual controlling self. Then she had heard that the land was in my name and realized the whole thing had been built on a lie. I did not say much. I was too tired to pretend I was surprised. She was the first person who asked whether I was okay instead of whether I was going to forgive him. That mattered more than I expected. A week later, I met with the bank's loan officer. I wanted to know exactly where things stood. because I had learned enough by then to stop trusting anyone who spoke about the project in general terms. The loan had been structured with the property as collateral, which meant my ownership mattered a lot more than my dad had admitted. The officer confirmed that my canceled funding had triggered a hold and that the next stage would depend on whether I chose to continue. I did not. He also confirmed that my dad had been the one pushing for the upgrade package and extra work. That part did not surprise me. What did surprise me was how much of the money had already been exhausted on things that were not basic construction. The upgraded trim, the fancy fixtures, the enlarged garage, the custom pantry, a separate entryway Linda wanted for her daughter's visits, a soundproof room Ryan had supposedly needed for video work he never actually did. I had funded all of it while thinking I was helping build a practical home. Instead, I had helped pay for power play. Once I saw the numbers laid out by a banker who did not care about anyone's feelings, I felt my anger finally harden into something useful. I stopped apologizing in my own head. That was not easy. I had spent too many years being the son who kept things going, the one who fixed the leak, the one who transferred the money, the one who drove over on Sundays, the one who kept the peace at Thanksgiving, the one who did not force his father to face uncomfortable facts in front of other people. But the facts were already there. They had just been sitting under all the noise. A few days after that meeting, my dad showed up again. This time he brought papers. I did not let him inside, but I met him outside because I wanted the confrontation to happen in daylight where I could breathe. He looked exhausted in a way I had never seen, not humbled, not reflective, just exhausted. He tried a different tone. He said he was willing to work things out. He said we could keep the house in the family if I would just continue funding the build until completion and then work out living arrangements later. He said he had never meant to exclude me. He said the fight had gotten blown out of proportion. He said every family says stupid things when stressed. That was almost the saddest line of all because it was the closest thing he had to an apology without accepting responsibility. I told him I was done funding the project. I told him I was not interested in vague promises about future fairness. I told him I would not spend another dollar on a house I had been told to my face was not for me. He shifted from pleading to irritation in under a minute. He said I was making him look bad. I told him he did that himself. He said I was being cruel to Hannah because she loved the house. I told him Hannah's room still existed and that none of this was her fault. He said I was abandoning the family. I told him he had already told me I was not part of the family in any meaningful way when it mattered. That was when he finally stopped pretending to be reasonable. He started accusing me of wanting to embarrass him in front of everyone. He said the house was almost done. He said a few more months of help would solve everything. He said I was throwing away years of work over one fight. That was the one line that almost made me laugh again, because it was not one fight. It was years of small manipulations that had finally stacked high enough to look like one big betrayal. I told him the years of work were exactly why I knew what it had cost. I told him the numbers had not lied. He stared at me for a long second, then said he would talk to a lawyer. I said that was a good idea. He did not like how calm I sounded. That was obvious. People who rely on your emotions tend to panic when you stop supplying them. The weeks that followed were messy in a very ordinary way. Not dramatic, messy. Contractors wanted to know who was paying. The bank wanted updated instructions. My dad and Linda argued over bills. Hannah called me twice to ask whether the house was really going to stop. I told her I did not know. That was true. I wanted to be honest with her because she had not spent years lying to me. She was scared, and I understood that. Part of me felt guilty for the fallout. That never fully went away, even when I knew I had been right. I still felt guilty that other people were hurt by a system I did not create. That is one of the strangest parts of family conflict. Being right does not erase being sad. A month later, I got a package from my lawyer with several responses and one very important point. The contractor had filed a preliminary notice of lien. That meant if the remaining balance was not resolved, they could assert a claim against the property. The good news was that because I had kept everything documented, and because ownership was clear, I had leverage. The bad news was that my dad had gotten himself into a financial corner. He had signed agreements he did not fully understand. He had approved extras without checking what they cost. He had assumed the money would keep coming because it always had. Now he was looking at the possibility of taking the loss himself. That was the kind of consequence he had always escaped before. I did not celebrate it. I just made sure I understood it. At the end of that month, I finally agreed to one meeting with a mediator through the lawyer's office. Not because I wanted to save the house for my dad, because I wanted a clean resolution. The mediator was a retired judge who had seen worse family fights than ours. He listened. He asked for documents. He asked who owned what. He asked who paid what. He asked who authorized what. Then he looked at my dad and in a very dry way made it obvious there was no universe in which vague ownership talk beat a deed and a paper trail. That meeting was humiliating for my father. I could see it in the way he sat. He kept trying to posture, but every time he did, the paperwork pulled him back down. The mediator laid out the options. My dad could refinance the remaining work in his own name if he could qualify. He could settle with the contractor. He could try to buy out my interest in the property if he wanted to continue, or he could stop. Those were the options. My dad did not like any of them. He was used to options that came with my money attached. Looked at me during the meeting with the kind of anger that tries to become hurt when it realizes it has no force left. I did not flinch. That mattered because if I had flinched, he would have tried to use it. I told the mediator that I was willing to let the property proceed only if the ownership issue was fully respected and the previous unauthorized spending was settled. That effectively ended the fantasy of him controlling the whole thing without consequence. He could continue. Just not on my silence, not on my generosity, and definitely not on the lie that the house had ever been his to hand out like a reward. He chose not to continue. The next part was oddly anticlimactic. There was no huge blow-up, no smashed dishes, no police report, no dramatic legal showdown. He just backed away from the project when it became clear the free money was gone. That in itself told me everything I needed to know. The love of control was stronger than the love of the house. Once the money stopped, so did the commitment. The contractor eventually finished enough to make the place secure, but only after a reduced agreement that left a lot of the extras out. The fancy upgrades got cut. The soundproof room never happened. The second entryway disappeared from the plans. The custom pantry became a basic set of shelves. The garage stayed smaller than Linda wanted. The house that had been sold to me as a family dream ended up looking a lot more like a compromise. Which was fitting. My dad and Linda had to move into a rental for several months while the finances were sorted. That part was not my doing. It was just the natural result of the numbers. I heard later that my dad had to take a second job for a while and sell the truck he liked showing off. He had to pull money from retirement earlier than he wanted. He had to tell relatives that the project had been more expensive than planned. That was probably the hardest part for him, not the loss. The explanation. My Aunt Denise told me he sounded humiliated every time the family brought it up. She also told me Linda had stopped acting like the queen of the unfinished house once she realized it would not be the windfall she expected. That did not surprise me either. Some people only invest in belonging when belonging is profitable. Hannah stayed mostly neutral. I think she was old enough by then to understand that the adults had been using her as a witness to a fight that was not hers. She visited me a few times after that. Not at first, later. We started talking more honestly once the smoke cleared. She admitted she had seen the favoritism and just did not know how to say anything. I told her I understood. I had seen it too and still needed years to admit what it meant. As for my dad, he never really apologized in the way I wanted. He gave me pieces of one over time. A vague admission that maybe he should have handled the finances better. A muttered comment that the house project got out of hand. A half-hearted acknowledgement that I had paid more than he had, but he never fully owned the central truth. He had treated me as a funding source and then acted insulted when I started thinking like the owner. That part did not change. What did change was me. I stopped chasing his approval. I stopped trying to be the son who fixed everything. I stopped answering every call the moment it came in. I started keeping my distance in a way that would have seemed cold to the version of me that grew up wanting his praise. I do not regret that. What I regret is how long I waited to respect myself. About 6 months after the dinner, I drove out to the property alone. The house was standing by then, not perfect, not the dream they had sold themselves, but standing. The yard was still rough in spots. The trim around one window had not been finished right. The place looked like a compromise because that was exactly what it was. I walked through the rooms and thought about how many times I had stood there believing I was helping build a future that included me. Then I looked at the deed copies again, just because I still liked seeing my name on paper where it belonged. I realized something then that I wish I had understood earlier. The house had never really been the point. The point had been whether I was allowed to exist in my own family as a person instead of a resource. Once I saw that clearly, a lot of the old guilt fell away. My dad had not just insulted me, he had told on himself. He had admitted what the arrangement really was. Family for him meant obligation flowing one way. My support, my labor, my money, my silence. When I stopped supplying those things, the illusion fell apart. That was why his smile faded so hard at the table, not because I threatened him, because I finally understood the game and refused to keep playing it. A few months later, I used the land for something else entirely. Not revenge. Not a power move. I sold a small portion of the acreage after talking it through with my lawyer and a surveyor. The sale gave me enough to clear my own debts, rebuild my savings, and put money aside for a modest house of my own on the remaining land. Nothing extravagant, just mine, paid for with a sane budget. No one else's dream attached. When I signed the paperwork, I felt calmer than I had in years, not triumphant, calm. There is a difference. My dad found out eventually. He did not like it. He acted like I had betrayed a family legacy, which would have been funny if it had not been so predictable. But by then, his opinion had less weight than a stack of county records. That was the real lesson of the whole thing. People can spend years acting entitled to your time, your money, and your guilt. They can even build walls around those assumptions, but paperwork lasts longer than manipulation. Facts outlive moods, and once I stopped apologizing for asking to see the numbers, the whole structure of the lie collapsed. The house exists now in a limited way. My dad still lives there with Linda. Hannah visits when she wants. I keep my distance. We are not close. We are probably never going to be what he likes to call a normal family. But I own my ground. I know exactly what I paid. I know exactly what I stopped paying. I know exactly why his smile disappeared that night. And I know that the strongest thing I ever did was not yell back at him. It was sliding the will across the table, staying calm, and letting the truth do the rest. That truth did not make the pain disappear. It did not magically repair my relationship with my father. It did not turn him into a better man. But it did put me back in the position of not being taken advantage of anymore. That mattered more than winning an argument ever could. Even now, when I drive past that property, I think about my mom. I think about how carefully she must have arranged her papers. I think about how many times I missed the warning signs because I wanted to believe my dad was just struggling, not manipulating me. I think about how close I came to funding an entire house for people who were already planning how to squeeze me out of it. And I think about the night he said that house was for family, not for me. He meant to humiliate me. Instead, he forced the truth into the open. I am grateful for that in a strange way, because once the truth was visible, I could finally walk away from the version of family that only existed when I was paying for it.